Recording by Mike Venditti, MikeVenditti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey, Chapter 18. A black weight was seemingly lifted from Helen's weary eyelids. The sun shone, the golden forest surrounded her. The brook babbled merrily. But where were the struggling, panting men? She noticed presently, when her vision had grown more clear, that the scene differed entirely from the willow glade where she had closed her eyes upon the fight. Then came the knowledge that she had fainted, and, during the time of unconsciousness, been moved. She lay upon a mossy mound a few feet higher than a swiftly running brook. A magnificent chestnut tree spread its leafy branches above her. Directly opposite, about 100 feet away, loomed a gray, ragged, moss-stained cliff. She noted this particularly because the dense forest encroaching to its very edge excited her admiration. Such wonderful coloring seemed unreal. Dead gold and bright red foliage flamed everywhere. 2 Indians stood nearby, silent, immovable. No other of Leggett's band was visible. Helen watched the red men. Sinewy, muscular warriors they were, with bodies partially painted and long, straight hair, black as burnt wood, interwoven with bits of white bone and plaited around waving eagle plumes. At first glance their dark faces and dark eyes were expressive of craft, cunning, cruelty, courage, all attributes of the savage. Yet wild as these savages appeared, Helen did not fear them as she did the outlaws. Brandt's eyes, and Leggett's too, when turned on her, emitted a flame that seemed to scorch and shrivel her soul. When the savages met her gaze, which was but seldom, she imagined she saw intelligence, even pity, in their dusky eyes. Certain it was she did not shrink from them as from Brandt. Suddenly, with a sensation of relief and joy, she remembered Mordaunt's terrible onslaught upon Brandt. Although she could not recollect the termination of that furious struggle, she did recall Brandt's scream of mortal agony, and the death of the other at Case's hands. This meant, whether Brandt was dead or not, that the fighting strength of her captors had been diminished. Surely, as the sun had risen that morning, Helen believed Jonathan and Wetzel lurked on the trail of these renegades. She prayed that her courage, hope, strength might be continued. "Ugh!" exclaimed one of the savages, pointing across the open space. The slight swaying of the bushes told that some living thing was moving among them, and an instant later the huge frame of the leader came into view. The other outlaw and Case followed closely. Further down the margin of the thicket the Indians appeared, but without the slightest noise or disturbance of the shrubbery. It required but a glance to show Helen that Case was in high spirits. His repulsive face glowed with satisfaction. He carried a bundle which Helen saw, with a sickening sense of horror, was made up of Mordaunt's clothing. Brandt had killed the Englishman. Leggett also had a package under his arm, which he threw down when he reached the chestnut tree, to draw from his pocket a long leather belt, such as travelers use for the carrying of valuables. It was evidently heavy, and the musical clink which accompanied his motion proclaimed the contents to be gold. Brandt appeared next. He was white and held his hand to his breast. There were dark stains on his hunting coat, which he removed to expose a shirt blotched with red. "You ain't much hurt, I reckon?" inquired Leggett solicitously. "No, but I'm bleeding bad," replied Brandt coolly. He then called an Indian and went among the willows skirting the stream. "Somethin' to be in this border crew?" asked Case, looking up at Leggett. "Sure," replied the big outlaw. "You're a handy feller, Case, and after I break you into border ways, you will fit in here tip-top. Now, you'd better stick by me. When Eb Zane, his brother Jack, and Winslow find out this here day's work, Hell will be a cool place compared with their whereabouts. You'll be safe with me, and this is the only place on the border, I reckon, where you can say your life is your own." "I'm your mate, Captain. I've sailed with soldiers, pirates, sailors, and I guess I can navigate this borderland. Do we mess here? You didn't come far." "Well, I ain't particular, but I don't like eatin' with buzzards," said Leggett with a grin. "That's why we moved a bit." "What's buzzards?" "Oh, maybe you'll have 'em closer'n you'd like some day, if you'd only know it. Buzzards are fine birds, most particular birds as won't eat nothin' but flesh, and white man or Injun is pie for 'em." "Captain, I've seed birds as wouldn't wait till a man was dead," said Case. "Oh, can't come no sailor yarns on this feller. Well, now we've got the Englishman's gold, one or t'other of us might just as well have it all." "Right you are, Captain. Dice, cards, anyways, so long as I knows the game." "Here, Jink, hand over your clickers and bring us a flat stone," said Leggett, sitting on the moss and emptying the belt in front of him. Case took a small bag from the dark blue jacket that had so lately covered Mordaunt's shoulders, and poured out its bright contents. "This coat ain't worth keeping," he said, holding it up. The garment was rent and slashed, and under the left sleeve was a small blood-stained hole where one of Brandt's blows had fallen. "Hello, what's this?" muttered the sailor, feeling in the pocket of the jacket. "Blast my timbers! Hooray!" He held up a small, silver-mounted whiskey flask, unscrewed the lid, and lifted the vessel to his mouth. "I'm kind of thirsty myself," suggested Leggett. "Captain, a nip and no more," Case replied, holding the flask to Leggett's lips. The outlaw called Jenks now returned with a flat stone, which he placed between the two men. The Indians gathered around. With greedy eyes they bent their heads over the gamblers, and watched every movement with breathless interest. At each click of the dice or clink of gold they uttered deep exclamations. "Luck's agin you, Captain," said Case, skillfully shaking the ivory cubes. "Ain't I got eyes?" growled the outlaw. Steadily his pile of gold diminished, and darker grew his face. "Captain, I'm a bad wind to draw," Case rejoined, drinking again from the flask. His naturally red face had become livid, his skin moist, and his eyes wild with excitement. "Hello, if them dice wasn't Jenks, and I hadn't played afore with them, I'd swear they's loaded." "You ain't insinuating nothin', Captain?" inquired Case softly, hesitating with the dice in his hand, his evil eyes glinting at Leggett. "Nah, you're fair enough," growled the leader. "My tough luck." The game progressed with infrequent runs of fortune for the outlaw, and presently every piece of gold lay in a shining heap before the sailor. "Clean busted," exclaimed Leggett in disgust. "Can't you find nothin' more?" asked Case. The outlaw's bold eyes wandered here and there until they rested upon the prisoner. "I'll play their lass against your pile of gold," he growled. "Best two throws out of 3. See here, she's as much mine as Brandt's. Me can have my pile on, and I'll go you." "Nary time. Better give me back what you're win," replied Leggett gruffly. "She's a trim little craft, no mistake," said Case, critically surveying Helen. "All right, Captain. Sportin' blood, and I'll bet your throw first." Leggett won the first cast, and Case was second. With deliberation the outlaw shook the dice in his huge fist and rattled them out upon the stone. "Oh!" he cried in delight. He had come within one of the highest score possible. Case nonchalantly flipped the little white blocks. The Indians crowded forward, their dusky eyes shining. Liggett swore in a terrible voice which re-echoed from the stony cliff. The sailor was victorious. The outlaw got up, kicked the stone and dice in the brook, and walked away from the group. He strode to and fro under one of the trees. Gruffly he gave an order to the Indians. Several of them began at once to kindle a fire. Presently he called Jenks, who was fishing the dice out of the brook, and began to converse earnestly with him, making fierce gestures and casting lowering glances at the sailor. Case was too drunk now to see that he had incurred the enmity of the outlaw leader. He drank the last of the rum and tossed the silver flask to an Indian, who received the present with every show of delight. Case then, with the slow, uncertain movements of a man whose mind is befogged, began to count his gold, but only to gather up a few pieces when they slipped out of his trembling hands to roll on the moss. Laboriously, seriously, he kept at it with the doggedness of a drunken man. Apparently he had forgotten the others. Failing to learn the value of the coins by taking up each in turn, he arranged them in several piles, and began to estimate his wealth in sections. In the meanwhile, Helen, who had not failed to take in the slightest detail of what was going on, saw that a plot was hatching which boded ill to the sailor. Moreover, she heard Liggett and Jenks whispering. "I can take him from right here 'twixt his eyes," said Jenks softly, and tapped his rifle significantly. "Well, go ahead, only I'd rather have it done quieter," answered Liggett. "We're yet a long ways, near 30 miles from my camp, and there's no tellin' who's in their woods. But we've got to get rid of their fresh sailor, and there's no surer way." Cautiously cocking his rifle, Jenks deliberately raised it to his shoulder. One of the Indian sentinels, who stood near at hand, sprang forward and struck up the weapon. He spoke a single word to Liggett, pointed to the woods above the cliff, and then resumed his statue-like attitude. "I told yer, Jenks, that wouldn't do it. The redskins scent something in the woods, and there's an Injun I never seed fooled. We mustn't make a noise. Take your knife and tomahawk, crawl down below the edge of the bank, and slip up on him. I'll give half their gold for the job." Jenks buckled his belt more tightly, gave one threatening glance at the sailor, and slipped over the bank. The bed of the brook lay about 6 feet below the level of the ground. This afforded an opportunity for the outlaw to get behind Case without being observed. A moment passed. Jenks disappeared round a bend in the stream. Presently his grizzled head appeared above the bank. He was immediately behind the sailor, but still some 30 feet away. This ground must be covered quickly and noiselessly. The outlaw began to crawl. In his right hand he grasped a tomahawk, and between his teeth was a long knife. He looked like a huge yellow bear. The savages, with the exception of the sentinel, who seemed absorbed in the dense thicket on the cliff, sat with their knees between their hands, watching the impending tragedy. Nothing but the merest chance or some extraordinary intervention could avert Case's doom. He was gloating over his gold. The creeping outlaw made no more noise than a snake. Nearer and nearer he came, his sweaty face shining in the sun, his eyes tigerish, his long body slipping silently over the grass. At length he was within 5 feet of the sailor. His knotty hands were dug into the sward as he gathered energy for a sudden spring. At that very moment Case, with his hand on his knife, rose quickly and turned around. The outlaw, discovered in the act of leaping, had no alternative, and spring he did, like a panther. The little sailor stepped out of line with remarkable quickness, and as the yellow body whirled past him, his knife flashed blue bright in the sunshine. Jenks fell forward, his knife buried in the grass beneath him, and his outstretched hand still holding the tomahawk. "Trying to double-cross me for my gold," muttered the sailor. Sheathing his weapon, he never looked to see whether or no his blow had been fatal. "These border fellers might think a man as sails the seas can't handle a knife." He calmly began gathering up his gold, evidently indifferent to further attack. Helen saw Liggett raise his own rifle, but only to have it struck aside as had Jenks. This time the savage whispered earnestly to Liggett, who called the other Indians around him. The sentinel's low, throaty tones mingled with the soft babbling of the stream. No sooner had he ceased speaking than the effect of his words showed how serious had been the information, warning, or advice. The Indians cast furtive glances towards the woods. Two of them melted like shadows into the red and gold thicket. Another stealthily slipped from tree to tree until he reached the open ground, then dropped into the grass, and was seen no more until his dark body rose under the cliff. He stole along the green-stained wall, climbed a rugged corner, and vanished amid the dense foliage. Helen felt that she was almost past discernment or thought. The events of the day, succeeding one another so swiftly and fraught with panic, had, despite her hope and fortitude, reduced her to a helpless condition of piteous fear. She understood that the savages scented danger, or had, in their mysterious way, received intelligence such as rendered them wary and watchful. "Come on now, and make no noise," said Liggett to Case. "Bring the girl, and see that she steps light." "Aye, Captain," replied the sailor. "Where's Brandt?" "He'll be comin' soon's his cut stops bleedin'. I reckon he's weak yet." Case gathered up his goods, and, tucking it under his arm, grasped Helen's arm. She was leaning against a tree, and when he pulled her, she wrenched herself free, raising with difficulty. His disgusting touch and revolting face had revived her sensibilities. "Here, you can begin duty by carrying that," said Case, thrusting the package into Helen's arms. She let it drop without moving a hand. "I'm running this ship. You belong to me," hissed Case, and then he struck her on the head. Helen uttered a low cry of distress and half staggered against a tree. The sailor picked up the package. This time she took it, trembling with horror. "That's right. Now give her Captain a kiss." He leered and jostled against her. Helen pushed him violently. With agonized eyes she appealed to the Indians. They were engaged tying up their packs. Liggett looked on with a lazy grin. "Uh-oh," breathed Helen as Case seized her again. She tried to scream, but could not make a sound. The evil eyes, the beastly face, transfixed her with terror. Case struck her twice, then roughly pulled her toward him. Half fainting, unable to move, Helen gazed at the heated, bloated face approaching hers. When his coarse lips were within a few inches of her lips, something hot hissed across her brow. Following so closely as to be an accompaniment, rang out with singular clearness the sharp crack of a rifle. Case's face changed. The hot, surging flush faded. The expression became shaded, dulled into vacant emptiness. His eyes rolled wildly, then remained fixed, with a look of dark surprise. He stood upright an instant, swayed with the regular poise of a falling oak, and then plunged backward to the ground. His face, ghastly and livid, took on the awful calm of death. A very small hole, reddish blue round the edges, dotted the center of his temple. Liggett stared aghast at the dead sailor. Then he possessed himself of the bag of gold. "Save me their trouble," he muttered, giving Case a kick. The Indians glanced at the little figure, then out into the flaming thickets. Each savage sprang behind a tree with incredible quickness. Liggett saw this, and grasping Helen, he quickly led her within cover of the chestnut. Brandt appeared with his Indian companion, and both leaped to shelter behind a clump of birches near where Liggett stood. Brandt's hawk eyes flashed upon the dead Jenks and Case. Without asking a question, he seemed to take in the situation. He stepped over and grasped Helen by the arm. "Who killed Case?" he asked in a whisper, staring at the little blue hole in the sailor's temple. No one answered. The two Indians who had gone into the woods to the right of the stream now returned. Hardly were they under the trees with their party when the savage who had gone off alone arose out of the grass in the left of the brook, took it with a flying leap, and darted into their midst. He was the sentinel who had knocked up the weapons, thereby saving Case's life twice. He was lithe and supple, but not young. His grave, shadowy-lined, iron visage showed the traces of time and experience. All gazed at him at once, whose wisdom was greater than theirs. "Old horse," said Brandt in English. "Haven't I seen bullet holes like this?" The Chippewa bent over Case, and then slowly straightened his tall form. "Deathwind," he replied, answering in the white man's language. His Indian companions uttered low, plaintive murmurs, not signifying fear so much as respect. Brandt turned as pale as the clean birch bark on the tree near him. The gray flare of his eyes gave out a terrible light of certainty and terror. "Liggett, you needn't try to hide your trail," he hissed, and it seemed as if there was a bitter, reckless pleasure in these words. Then the Chippewa glided into the low bushes bordering the creek. Liggett followed him, with Brandt leading Helen, and the other Indians brought up the rear, each one sending wild, savage glances into the dark, surrounding forest. End of Chapter 18.